Hi, I'm Lee Kondarachi. This is my presentation, Cultural Sniping by Gaslight, Confronting Gender Violence in Theatrical Revivals. This is part of my larger dissertation work in staging gender violence and sexual violence in contemporary theater. Today I will discuss a reimagined, critical feminist production of Patrick Hamilton's 1938 play, Gaslight, which I directed in February of this year in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. Our project with this show was to stage Hamilton's original play in a way that exposes and subverts the misogyny present in the text, while recentering the narrative around the main woman character, Bella Manningham. Using Elaine Aston's guidelines for feminist cultural sniping of canonical works, the cast, creative team, and I reframe Hamilton's detective thriller as a survivor story, in which Bella advocates for herself, performs acts of resistance, and ultimately rejects the patriarchal structures that enable and perpetuate domestic violence. In 2022, most of us are familiar with the term gaslighting. This is a form of psychological abuse where the abuser makes a victim question their own reality, leading them to believe that they are, quote, crazy. The term originates from Hamilton's play, which was made into a film in 1944 directed by Jorge. In Gaslight, Jack Manningham is deliberately trying to drive his wife Bella to madness so that he can claim a set of jewels that he believes are hidden in their house. Jack's behavior and Bella's disorientation are a devastatingly clear example of what we now call gaslighting at work. Now, the Q-Core film was a Hollywood hit, and it continues in the gothic romance genre, sometimes called the female gothic, where recent films like Alfred Hitchcock's adaptation of Rebecca in 1940 had been very successful. In the female gothic, the sites of terror are domestic spaces and intimate relationships. And the genre shows how patriarchal violence can manifest even in the smallest, most personal spaces. Literary and film scholar Diane Shoes notes that the Gaslight film is a significant cultural touchstone because it explicitly represents psychological and emotional abuse, and this led to a broader popular understanding of these tactics as violence and as abuse. And it's perhaps unlikely that Patrick Hamilton, a man writing in the 1930s, intentionally tried to represent the experiences of women living in patriarchy as such. Hamilton's original play, which he calls a Victorian thriller, is a detective story. Its emphasis is on the hero policeman taking down the villain rather than on Bella's personal journey. As Diane Shoes has noted, the themes, relationships, and settings represented in Gaslight, both the play and the film, are well established in the female Gothic tradition. However, I observe that Hamilton's play, as written, privileges male perspectives and caters to what Jill Dolan would identify as the ideal white male spectator. We created our production with a critical intersectional feminist mindset, with an intended audience of survivors of domestic abuse and gender-based violence. Our reading emphasizes the ways in which individuals and institutions who are supposed to protect and care for women often betray and do violence to them for their own benefit. This is a very female Gothic concept, but to be clear, simply highlighting and repeating Gothic romantic tropes in performance is not progressive critical feminist work. And besides, this has already been done nearly 80 years ago in Q-Core's film. Also, as a historically white-centered genre, the female Gothic itself has limitations when it comes to representation of women in survivor narratives. Our project with Gaslight is to critique the misogyny within Hamilton's text, as well as to challenge a female Gothic tradition that centers white women's narratives. Our cultural sniping targets the structural violence present even in the art that has been useful for articulating women and survivors' experiences. Above all, our performance aims to affirm women and survivors in their instincts, experiences, and perceptions, and validates their acts of resistance, both large and small. Our hope is that survivors who see this show will identify with Bella, that they'll experience catharsis through her journey, and that they'll feel recognized and ultimately empowered as she steps into her own power. So what is cultural sniping? What is this term that I've been using? So Elaine Aston, who is a theater researcher and practitioner, suggests a process for cultural sniping with canonical plays. And this is creating a subversive narrative that performs the original text while exposing and critiquing its oppressive ideologies. Aston credits this idea to the photographer, Jo Spence, who suggested it was possible to fight against the dominant culture while operating within it by engaging in small acts of artistic warfare. And doing resistant work with these more traditional texts can expose the violence in texts that are considered foundational and in the cultures and systems that canonize these texts. And it can also reach audiences who primarily or maybe exclusively attend mainstream theater. Aston's concept of cultural sniping in theater involves creative decisions in casting, staging, and performance that infuse the play with new, vital, exciting resonance for feminist spectators. Our cultural sniping project offers an intersectional feminist subversion of Hamilton's original text and of popular white feminist survivor narratives. Our Gaslight presents at its center the narrative of a Black woman navigating a domestic space and marriage that are toxic, not simply because of her husband Jack's specific actions towards Bella, but because of how his abuse plays into socio-cultural dynamics of power and control. Tatiana Naya Ford, who is the actress playing Bella, establishes from the beginning of our process that her identity as a Black woman would necessarily shape the way that she developed the character and her interpretation of the narrative. Aston emphasizes the need for ongoing dialogue so that the creative team can, quote, share their anxieties about a master text that may have a gender, class, or race, or a combination of these base, end quote. And she also stresses that an effective feminist cultural sniping practice should be grounded in feminist research. For Gaslight, I did a lot of my own scholarly research, and I brought this to the cast and creative team, and all of us engaged our own knowledge and experiences in extended discussion throughout the rehearsal process. And some topics of research and conversation included Hamilton's text and the Q-Core film, domestic violence, with particular attention to gaslighting and psychological violence as modes of abuse, intersectional feminist analyses of gender-based violence and domestic abuse. And maintaining communication throughout rehearsal works to ensure that all of the artists are feeling safe and empowered in this creative work that often requires vulnerability and risk. And this also enables a process that is truly collaborative with a collective vision rather than that of just a single director. Because Hamilton's play is dominated by men and patriarchal violence, maintaining Bella as the central connecting figure throughout this play was a challenge. Cultural sniping brings women characters and their narratives to life, not only through creative delivery of the text that's written, but through the words that are not there, using action and expression to communicate what the text does not. Ultimately, we work through the text and also in the spaces around and within it to create an arc for Bella that transcends the patriarchal confines of the play's words at a textual level and its world at thematic and narrative levels. A guiding concept that I established with the cast pretty much from the get-go is the power of eye contact to create relationships between characters and the audience. So I set up a boundary for the actors. The woman characters, and particularly Bella, engage the audience in eye contact, but the men characters are cut off from audience eye contact. And this intention is twofold, okay? So firstly, it sets up Bella as the audience's touchstone character, and her story as the primary narrative that we follow. And cutting the men off from audience connection discourages the inclination to root for Detective Ruff as the hero, which Hamilton's text encourages. Secondly, Bella's recognition of the audience, and thus a world beyond the confines of the play text and the performance, introduces a possibility that the character will transcend the oppression of her world in the play. Bell Hooks writes of a Black feminist mode of spectatorship that finds, quote, visual pleasure in a context where looking is also about contestation and confrontation, end quote. And she calls this the oppositional gaze. With Gaslight, we turn an oppositional gaze towards Hamilton's text and towards the white female Gothic tradition. And we take the audience with us on this journey. So in her moments of connection with the audience, Bella invites spectators to share her critical oppositional gaze towards the male characters and their violence. Furthermore, Tatiana's purposeful continued eye contact encourages that sense of identification, among spectators who feel resonance with Bella's experience and identity as a woman, as a survivor, and particularly as a Black woman survivor. Now, as written, the character of Bella may seem frustratingly weak to a 21st century audience, but Tatiana performs Bella as a self-aware, self-possessed, vibrant, tenacious woman who is trapped in a horrifying but all too relatable domestic violence situation. Within the confines of systemic white supremacist patriarchy, as well as her own domestic space and her abusive marriage, Bella performs small but significant acts of resistance, which escalate in magnitude by the end of the play. Bella becomes empowered to trust herself and her perceptions, ultimately claiming her own space and identity, free from the patriarchal figures who have oppressed and manipulated her throughout the play. Though Bella is constricted by her relationship with Jack in many ways, both physically within the home and psychologically through manipulation and coercive control, she does perform acts of resistance within these confines. Bella calls out instances of Jack's cruel behavior rather than silently accepting them. She articulates her emotional needs to Jack and tries to tell him how he should treat her, with kindness and care and gentleness. And in doing so, Bella demonstrates great self-awareness and self-advocacy. In the context of their home and relationship, Jack fails to acknowledge Bella's pain and instead questions her mental stability, leaving her without any ally or recourse. In our staging, though, Bella has a room full of allies in the audience. Her connection with the audience through the gaze affirms that her experience is not imagined and her pain is valid. Tatiana and I discussed how the witnessing, affirming audience works to encourage her as Bella in her acts of resistance. As Bella becomes more confident in her intuition and self-knowledge throughout the play, and as she discovers more truths about Jack's violence, she builds to her ultimate forceful rejection of Jack himself and of patriarchal oppression, as embodied in both Jack and Detective Ruff. One audience member said after seeing our production of Gaslight, "There are no good guys in this play." And she was right. Although Jack is the obvious villain of the play, Detective Ruff is not the hero that Hamilton makes him out to be. Ruff not only performs misogyny at an interpersonal level, but he represents the role of the state in maintaining patriarchal order. From the moment Detective Ruff enters, Hamilton writes in his stage direction, he, quote, completely dominates the scene from the beginning. Throughout their scenes together, Ruff consistently speaks over Bella and cuts her off, overwhelms and confuses her with lengthy and convoluted speeches, and makes patronizing comments. Exercising benevolent sexism, Ruff repeatedly commands Bella to sit down, presumably because it's too laborious for her to remain standing. Ruff is cartoonishly blustering and indelicate at times, but Hamilton also valorizes the detective as clever, quick-thinking, and supremely agentic. He's a bit rough around the edges, no subtlety with that character name, but he gets the job done, and by the end of the play, he arrests Jack, the bad guy, and saves the day. In our production, we subvert Hamilton's heroization of Detective Ruff by having Bella respond to Ruff's behavior in nonverbal ways that acknowledge and critique his misogyny, primarily through that power of her gaze. Bella's connection with the audience through her oppositional gaze allows a shared critique of Ruff to which he is not privy. Each time Ruff treats Bella with disrespect, she acknowledges it by checking in with the audience, establishing that, yes, we saw that, and yes, we see her. We laugh with her. We are on her side, because a surreptitious exchanged look at a joke at the expense of an oblivious patriarchal jerk, that's a small act of support and resistance. As written, the play presents a shocking act of physical violence in its final moments. Bella calls for the police standing outside her door to come and take Jack away, and Hamilton notes that, quote, she is completely hysterical. After Jack has been removed, Hamilton gives the stage directions. Mrs. Manningham stands apart, trembling with homicidal rage. Ruff takes her by the shoulders sternly. She struggles to get away. He slaps her across the face. She is momentarily stunned. Ostensibly, this is Ruff knocking some sense into her, so to speak. For the ideal white male spectator, a furious, emotional woman is potentially a threat to the order of male dominance. Bella has already disrupted patriarchal order by refusing to obey her husband Jack, verbally redressing him and ousting him from the home. In order to restore patriarchal order, Hamilton has Detective Ruff save the day once again, this time from agenic femininity. After the slap, Bella's wild fury has resolved in weeping, a much more passive and appropriately feminine behavior. Ruff then switches back to benevolent sexism, crooning, quote, "Now, my dear, come and sit down. You've had a bad time. I came in from nowhere and gave you the most horrible evening of your life, didn't I? The most horrible evening of anyone's life, I should imagine." Bella, now fully complacent with this new patriarchal order with Ruff, not Jack, at the head, replies, "The most horrible? Oh no. The most wonderful. Far and away, the most wonderful." Bella's affirming response here validates not only that final slap, but all of Ruff's misogynistic behavior throughout the play, establishing him once again as the hero and reinscribing hegemonic masculine order. There was absolutely no way that we were doing the ending like that. To begin with, staging the slap, a grossly misogynistic act, had too much potential for traumatizing of actors as well as survivors in the audience. Because this production was made for an audience of survivors of gender violence and abuse, we wanted an ending that was empowering and offered hope for a future that is free from patriarchal violence. In our staging, Bella's repeated line, "Come and take this man away," is delivered first as an instruction to remove Jack from the home, and then becomes a directive shouted directly at Detective Ruff. "Take this man away," screamed at Ruff with all of Bella's rage behind it, holds the subtext, "Take yourself away." Ruff is taken aback by Bella's aggression towards him, but his surprise shifts quickly to anger. How dare she speak to him this way? And he raises his hand to strike her. And in that moment, Bella stops shouting and locks eyes with Ruff, her gaze powerful enough to stop him in his tracks. He lowers his hand, and his aggression immediately dissolves into shame. His thinly veiled toxicity is now fully exposed, his facade of self-control shattered. Ruff does not strike Bella, but both of them know that he was going to, and so does the audience. This intention is enough, even without the follow-through, to reveal the full ugliness of that character, and we all know it. Ruff fumbles over his final lines, as though grasping for shreds of his masculine authority, feebly imploring Bella to come and sit down one last time, and knowing she will not. Bella, stoic, gestures to the door. Detective Ruff skulks off stage, humbled. And alone, finally, Bella makes her way downstage as the lights grow brighter around her. Meeting the audience's gaze, she delivers her final lines, indicating that in spite of the trauma represented throughout the play, this experience has been, quote, "far and away the most wonderful." With patriarchal violence in individual and systemic forms as embodied in Jack and Ruff, the policeman, banished from the space, and with a newfound sense of personal empowerment, Bella can finally look towards a hopeful future. And this subversion of Hamilton's ending is, I think, our greatest liberty with the original text. Even though all we changed was stage direction, and not any spoken lines. However, it is a move I am especially proud of. Our hijacking of Hamilton's original ending and intention speaks to the goal of cultural sniping, which is to seize opportunities for surprise attacks on dominant ideologies within traditional and mainstream texts and spaces. Just as Bella performs small and increasingly greater acts of resistance within her home and relationship, cultural snipers can take aim at our most comfortable, lived-in texts and the toxicity that resides within them. Thank you for attending my presentation. If you would like to get in touch with me, if you have any questions or would like to talk more, I would love that. Feel free to shoot me an email at leecon@udel.edu. Have a great day.